On a Monday afternoon in August 1939, a coroner's jury sat in a village hall in Suffolk and settled who owned a heap of gold that had come out of a field 3 weeks earlier. The men on that jury were not asked how old it was. They were not asked what it meant, or who had been buried with it, or whether it changed anything about the history of England, which it did. They were asked one question, and it was a question about property. Did this belong to the crown, or did it belong to the woman who owned the field? Laid out for them was the richest thing that has ever been lifted out of English soil. Gold shoulder clasps, set with garnet, cut and fitted so finely that a modern jeweler would think twice about attempting them. A purse lid of gold and enamel. A great silver dish stamped in Constantinople. Bowls, spoons, a sword, the crushed iron shell of a helmet. Nobody in the room could say whose grave it had been. Everybody in the room could say who owned the ground it came out of, because she was sitting in it. We remember Sutton, who was archaeology, as the find that rewrote the Anglo-Saxon centuries and turned a poem people had treated as fantasy into a description of something real. That is what it became. It is not how it arrived. It arrived as a legal problem about ownership, decided by a jury of local men under a rule of law written down in the 1760s, and the decision they reached is the reason the gold is where it is today. Here is the ground we are going to cover. What the woman who owned that heath actually paid for it, and why she started digging. The man she hired to do the digging, and the wage she paid him, which is one of the great bargains in the history of this country. The law of treasure trove, which is stranger than you would guess and turns on a single word. The afternoon in the village hall. What she did the moment the verdict was read, which very few people in her position would have done. And the Act of Parliament that exists because the old law let a find like this one slip straight through it. Start with the law, because the whole story is bent around it. The rule the coroner had to put to that jury came down almost unchanged from Blackstone writing in the 1760s. Treasure trove is where any money or coin, gold, silver, plate, or bullion is found hidden in the earth or other private place, the owner thereof being unknown. If the thing was hidden and the owner cannot be found, it belongs to the crown. If it was not hidden, but simply lost, or abandoned, or laid down with no thought of coming back for it, then it belongs to whoever owns the land. Read that again and notice what it does not mention. Not age, not importance, not gold content, not whether a national museum wants it. Only the intention of a person who died 13 centuries ago. And here is the question this whole story comes down to, so put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. Should a find like that ever belong to one private person at all? See whether you still think the same thing by the end. Edith Pretty had bought the estate in 1926, a few hundred acres of light sandy heath above the River Deben, with a house, some farmland, and a view. The price on the conveyance was £15,250. It was not a bargain, and it was not a fortune. It was the sort of sum a woman of her background could write a check for without consulting anybody, and that fact matters later, because everything that came out of that ground came out of it at her expense and by her decision. She was a daughter of a Lancashire industrialist, well-travelled, well-read, and used to running things. She had married late in the year she bought the house. Her son was born when she was in her middle 40s. Her husband died in 1934, 8 years into the marriage, and she was left in a large house on a quiet estate with a small boy, a staff, and a stretch of heath that nobody had ever bothered to examine properly. From the windows on that side of the house, you could see them. A group of low grassy mounds on the higher ground, 18 or so, some of them barely a swelling in the turf, one of them large enough that it read as a hill. Farmers had ploughed around them for centuries. The rabbits had been through them. Local people knew they were there in the way you know a wall is there, which is to say, they had stopped seeing them at all. There had been diggers before. Somebody in the 16th century had gone into several of them looking for gold, in an age when that was a normal and legal way to spend a summer. Later hands had poked about with less method and less luck. As far as anyone in Suffolk was concerned, the mounds had been done. Whatever had been in them was gone, and what remained was a set of humps on poor grazing land. It is worth saying why anything royal would be there at all, because it explains the wealth as much as the burials do. The Deben is a tidal river running up from the North Sea, and a ship could come off the open water and be rowed inland on the tide to a landing below that heath. A few miles further up sits Rendlesham, which Bede names as a residence of the kings of the East Angles. This was not a remote corner of a poor island. It was a doorstep facing the continent, with a royal centre behind it and a river doing the work a road could not. Mrs. Pretty did not accept that. She had an interest in the past that was partly scholarly and partly something else, of the sort that was quite common in her generation when a great many respectable people attended séances and thought there might be something in it. Whatever moved her, the practical step she took was entirely sensible. She wrote to the museum at Ipswich and asked whether anyone there could tell her what was in her field. Guy Maynard, the curator at Ipswich, could not come himself, and he had no budget worth the name. What he had was a man he trusted, and he suggested her. "Send for Basil Brown," he said, in effect, "and let him look." That recommendation is the hinge of the entire story, and it was made because a provincial museum had no money and one very good pair of hands. Basil Brown had left school at 12. He was a Suffolk man, the son of a farmer, self-taught in Latin, in astronomy, in geology, and in the reading of soil, which turned out to be the skill that mattered. He had written a book about the stars. He had worked as a farm labourer, an insurance agent, and anything else that paid. He had no degree and no institution behind him, and he knew the ground of that county in a way no university man did, because he had spent his life standing on it. His wage for that work was 30 shillings a week, paid by Mrs. Pretty out of her own pocket, with his lodging thrown in with the estate chauffeur and the loan of 2 of her labourers when he needed hands. 30 shillings, £1.50. It was a fair rate for a skilled outdoor man in 1938, and it was not generous. Nobody involved thought they were funding a national event. She thought she was satisfying her curiosity, and he thought he had a summer's work. That is what discovery cost in this country before the war. Not a grant, not a department, not a survey. One private landowner's spending money, a wheelbarrow, a shed to keep tools in, and a man on a farm wage. Every account of Sutton Hoo that starts with the gold gets this backwards. The gold is the end of the process. The beginning is a line in a household ledger that would not have looked out of place next to the bill for coal. Through the summer of 1938, Brown opened 3 of the smaller mounds. In each one, he found the same thing, which was the shape of something wonderful and the evidence that somebody else had got there first. Robbed chambers. Broken fragments. In one of them, iron shit rivets still lying in their lines, which told him that these people had buried their dead in boats. He came away with almost nothing to show, and one enormous piece of knowledge, and Mrs. Pretty paid him for the season and asked him to come back. Brown went back to the mounds in the spring of 1939, and this time she pointed at the big one. He would have chosen differently. His instinct, sensibly enough, was to work through the small ones first and build up a picture. She was the one paying. She wanted the largest mound opened, and she got her way, which is the second decision in this story that turns entirely on who owned what. He cut a trench in from the eastern end, in the old style, with two of the estate men to shift the sand. Within a few days, one of them turned up a corroded lump of iron the size of a fist. Brown recognized it immediately because he had seen its brothers the previous summer. It was a ship rivet. He stopped the men, told them to work with far more care than they thought necessary, and went looking for the next one. He found it exactly where a shipwright would have put it. Then another and another, each in line, each holding the memory of a plank that was no longer there. This is the part of the story that professional archaeologists still talk about, because what Brown did next was very difficult, and he did it alone. The wood of the ship had rotted away entirely in that acid sand. What was left was a stain, a slightly darker curve in the sand, no more substantial than a shadow, with iron rivets sitting in it where they had been hammered. He followed the shadow, not with a spade, but with a trowel, a brush, and a great deal of patience, taking the loose fill out of the inside of a shape he could not see and had to feel for, leaving the stain standing. Any ordinary excavator would have dug straight through it and never known it had been there. Over weeks of that work, out of a Suffolk field, there appeared the impression of a ship 90 feet from end to end, complete, down to the lines of her planking, with not one plank surviving. It is the strangest fact in the whole affair. The ship at Sutton is not a ship. It is a ship-shaped absence, a hole in the ground in the precise form of a vessel that dissolved before the Norman conquest. It was photographed, measured, and drawn, and then, when the war came, the sand fell back into it. What is presented to visitors today is the mold, not the object. The most famous ship in English archaeology has not existed for more than 1,000 years. She was big. 90 feet, room for 40 oarsmen at the oar positions, clinker built and dragged up from the River Deben to the top of a 100-foot slope by a considerable number of people who had nothing to gain from the effort. Somewhere in the middle of her, the diggers found what they had been half hoping for and half dreading. A collapsed chamber, roofed over once and fallen in, with something under it. 16th century treasure hunters had been here too. Their shaft came down almost exactly where it should have, into the center of the mound, and it missed. The reason it missed is a piece of luck so narrow that it is difficult to write down without sounding like invention. The ship had settled over the centuries, so the chamber lay deeper than the diggers of that age would have assumed, and the robber's shaft had stopped a few feet short of the roof and been abandoned. A summer's work, a few feet of sand, and the difference between the Sutton we have and a footnote about a plundered mound. Brown understood exactly what that meant. An intact chamber under a shit burial of that size was not a Suffolk story, it was a national one, and he was a man on 30 shillings a week with 2 farm labourers. he worked on with enormous care, cleared what he safely could, and made sure word went to Ipswich. Guy Maynard came out to look. Maynard told the Office of Works. The Office of Works told Cambridge. There is a version of this story in which that is the moment Basil Brown gets pushed out and disappears, and it is not quite true, but it is not far off. He knew what was coming. He wrote in his diary through the whole business, kept his measurements, and when the professionals arrived, he stayed on the site and kept working, doing the labor in the position of a man who has found the most important thing in the country and does not have the letters after his name to be allowed to lift it out. The men from London arrived in the second week of July, and from that moment Sutton Hoo stopped being a private excavation on a private estate and became something closer to a national operation, although still without any money to speak of. The Office of Works took charge of the dig. Mrs. Pretty went on providing the tea, the site, the labourers, and, technically, the ownership of everything in the ground. Charles Phillips was a fellow of a Cambridge college, a large, confident, capable man who understood at once what he had been handed. He took over the excavation of the burial chamber itself. Nobody has ever seriously argued that he should not have, given what was down there and how little of it could survive an error. He assembled a team, the way you assemble a cricket 11 at short notice, by telephoning people he knew and asking them to drop what they were doing. They came at their own expense and camped. Stuart Piggott came. Peggy Piggott came with him. W.F. Grimes came. O.G.S. Crawford came with a camera. There was no budget for any of it. Equipment was borrowed, boxes were begged from the village, moss was gathered from the heath to pack gold in, and the greatest treasure ever found in Britain was lifted out of the earth by a party of volunteers on their summer holidays, with war coming in 6 weeks. Peggy Piggott was the first to touch the gold. She had been given a corner of the chamber that Phillips thought was unpromising, on the reasonable grounds that a newer excavator should start where the risk was lowest, and in it she found the first pieces of gold and garnet jewelry to come up. It is a nice detail, and it is also a fair description of how the whole find behaved. Sutton Hoo kept rewarding whoever happened to be kneeling in the right square foot of sand. What came out of that chamber over the next 17 days is difficult to summarize without turning into a list, so here is the list. A pair of gold shoulder clasps inlaid with garnet and millefiori glass, hinged with a pin, made to fasten a ceremonial garment. A gold purse lid with 7 ornamental plaques. A great gold buckle, hollow with a sliding catch, a silver dish more than 2 feet across, stamped in Constantinople. A silver fluted bowl, a set of spoons, a hanging bowl with enamel escutcheons, drinking horns with silver gilt mounts, a sword with a gold and garnet pommel, an iron standard, a whetstone carved with faces, and the shattered remains of a helmet. One object in that list is not treasure at all and is the strangest thing in the chamber. A stone bar, the length of a forearm, carved with human faces at both ends, weighing several pounds and never once used to sharpen a blade. A whetstone that has never whetted anything is not a tool. It is an emblem of the right to command, and it was lying beside a man who could evidently afford to have one made. There was no body, not a bone, not a tooth. The sand at Sutton Hoo is acid enough to take a 90-foot ship down to a shadow, and it had done the same to whoever lay in the middle of that chamber. Later analysis of the soil found the chemical trace of a body that had gone entirely. So the richest grave in England is a grave with nobody in it, surrounded by everything a man was thought to need, arranged where his shoulders and his waist and his head had been. The photographs that everybody knows were not taken by the professionals. Two school teachers on holiday, Mercy Lack and Barbara Wagstaff, arrived at the site, were allowed to stay and photograph the excavation properly, including in color, which almost nobody was doing in 1939. Their pictures are the reason we can see the ship. The record of the greatest archaeological find in this country was made by two women whose job that August was supposed to be having a rest. The gold went into the house. There was no armored van and no police escort. Objects came up, were packed in moss and cigarette tins and boxes, and were carried to Sutton House, where they were put in the room the family used and, at one point, under a bed. The most valuable collection of early medieval metalwork in Europe spent part of that summer in a private house in Suffolk, insured by nobody, guarded by the fact that hardly anyone knew it was there. And then the law arrived, as the law does. Under the rules as they stood, any find of gold or silver in this country had to go before a coroner, who would summon a jury and hold an inquest to determine whether it was treasure trove. Not who found it, not what it was worth, not where it should be kept. One issue only, and it was the issue Blackstone had set out. Was this gold hidden by somebody who meant to come back for it? The date fixed was the 14th of August. Britain was 3 weeks from declaring war. Trenches were being dug in London parks, children's evacuation lists were drawn up, and in a village hall in Suffolk, a coroner sat down to decide the ownership of the burial goods of an Anglo-Saxon king, because the procedure required it, and nobody had the authority to skip a step. The hearing was held in the village hall at Sutton, and by the standards of what was on the table, it was a small, plain, local occasion. A coroner, a jury of local men, Mrs. Pretty, Charles Phillips, to give evidence about what had been found and what it was. The objects themselves, in front of the jury, laid out on a table in a parish hall with the sort of chairs you would expect. The coroner's direction was narrow, and he kept to it. The single question was whether the gold and silver had been hidden in the ground with the intention of recovery. If yes, then no matter who owned the field, it was treasure trove and the property of the Crown, with a reward paid at the Treasury's discretion to whoever had turned it up. If no, then the common law had nothing to say, and the objects belonged to the owner of the soil in which they lay. Everything therefore turned on the difference between hiding and burying. A merchant who puts his savings in a pot under the floor during a rebellion is hiding them, and he means to dig them up when the trouble passes. A community that rows a ship uphill, roofs a chamber over it, fills it with a man's arms and plate and coins, and then piles a mound over the top, is doing the exact opposite. It is a deposit that is meant to stay where it is. The whole point of it is that nobody is coming back. The evidence went that way, which was both convenient for Mrs. Pretty and, on the law, plainly correct. A grave is not a hiding place. Everything in that chamber had been put there in public, with ceremony, in front of a crowd, in a mound raised to be visible for miles from the river. You do not conceal a thing by building a landmark on top of it. The finding entered in the coroner's record was that the find was not treasure trove, and the property in it lay with the owner of the land. It took an afternoon. There was no appeal because the Crown had no basis to make one. On the 14th of August 1939, Edith Pretty of Sutton House became the legal owner of the gold, the silver, the sword, the helmet, the ship, and every object taken out of that mound. Understand what that verdict actually gave her. Not a reward, not a percentage, not the right to be consulted about where it went. The objects themselves, absolutely, to keep in a cabinet, to lend, to leave in her will, to sell in one lot or in 40. English law had just looked at the most significant assemblage of early medieval material ever found in these islands and said, in effect, this is a private chattel and it belongs to whoever owns the field it was under. That is exactly the sort of thing this channel exists to point at. The law did not weigh the importance of the find. It did not ask whether the nation had an interest. It asked a question about the state of mind of a person who died around the year 625, took its answer, and allocated the property accordingly. A different burial custom, a slightly different set of facts, and the same objects would have gone straight to the crown, and she would have received whatever the treasury felt like paying. And there was a market. That is the part people forget. 1939 was not a period of restraint in the trade in antiquities. American money was buying European collections. Dealers existed who could have placed those shoulder clasps quietly and well, and museums on 2 continents would have bid against each other for the helmet alone. She had no legal obligation to a single institution, and no export rules of the kind that exist now stood in her way. She could have realized a fortune. She had owned the treasure for a matter of weeks, and there is no evidence that she ever considered any of the things she was entitled to do with it. What she did instead was write to the British Museum and give them the lot. All of it. The gold, the silver, the ship fittings, the helmet, the sword, every object recovered from the mound, handed over as an outright gift to the nation, with no conditions attached about naming and no money changing hands in either direction. It remains the largest gift ever made to that museum by a living person. Not the most valuable purchase, not the greatest bequest, the largest gift from someone standing in the room. She had held legal title for less time than it takes most people to decide on a car, and she signed it away in a letter. Set what she gave away against what she had paid. £15,250 bought her the house, the farms, the woods, the heath and the mounds. What came out of one of those mounds has never been given a price by the museum that holds it, for the good reason that there is nothing to compare it with, and any figure attached to it would be a guess with several zeros in it. The gift was worth more than the estate, the house, the farms, and every acre she owned several times over, and she took nothing for it. One thing before we go on. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a new piece of British financial history every single day. She was offered a public honor and declined it. She did accept later that her name should be recorded as the donor, which is why it sits on the labels in Bloomsbury today. But she took no fee, sought no valuation, and never asked for a percentage of anything, and she did all of it in the weeks when the country was going onto a war footing and nobody was paying attention. Weigh the wage against what the wage found. 30 shillings a week for one summer bought the richest thing ever lifted out of English soil. The whole season of digging had cost a few pounds a week in labour and a few pounds more in tools and carting, and at the end of it, Basil Brown had exactly what he had been promised, which was his wages. He had no legal claim to a share of anything, because the law gave the finder nothing when the landowner owned the find. And for decades afterwards, the labels in the museum did not carry his name at all. 3 weeks after the inquest, the country was at war, and the treasure went underground for a second time. The objects were packed up and stored in a disused tunnel of the London Underground, in the dark, under a city that was about to be bombed, alongside other things the museum could not risk leaving above ground. They stayed there for the duration. The site itself had a worse war. Wait! The excavation was backfilled for its own protection. Bracken and turf came over it, and then the army arrived and used that stretch of Suffolk heath for training. Tracked vehicles went across the burial ground. Slit trenches were dug into it. Several of the smaller mounds were flattened or damaged by the defense of a country whose earliest royal grave lay directly underneath. Edith Pretty did not see any of it displayed. She died in 1942 at 59 with her gift in a tunnel and her heath under tank tracks. She never saw the helmet reconstructed, never saw the shoulder clasps in a case, never heard the words Sutton who used the way they are used now. She gave the thing away and then died before it was unwrapped. The field was gone over properly twice more. In the middle 1960s, the museum went back and excavated the ship again over several seasons, taking a cast of the impression so that the shape would survive the next collapse of the sand. Then, between the early 1980s and the early 90s, a research project reopened the whole burial ground, rather than the single famous mound, and asked the questions the 1939 dig had never had time for. It found two things worth knowing. In Mound 17, in 1991, an untouched grave, a young man buried with his weapons, his harness fittings, and, in a pit beside him, his horse. It is the only other intact burial in the field, and it says that the ship was not a freak, but the top end of a custom. And around the edges of the mounds, it found later graves of a very different kind, bodies of the 8th century and after, laid out in the postures of people who had been executed. The mound field kept its meaning for centuries after the gold went in. It became the place you were taken to die. Consider what was actually in that purse, because, for a channel about money, it is the single most interesting object in the chamber. The purse lid survived, gold and garnet and enamel, hinged to a belt. The leather it was fixed to did not. What lay inside it did, and it is the most precise evidence we have about how wealth actually worked in England before England existed. There were 37 gold coins in it. Alongside them were 3 unstruck blanks, discs of gold, the right size and weight for coins, but with no design on either face. 2 small ingots sat with the coins, plain lumps of gold valued only by what they weighed. Every one of the 37 is Merovingian, struck in the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel. Not one is English. That is not an accident of survival, it is the plain state of the economy. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of that period had no coinage of their own worth the name. Gold arrived here as somebody else's money, from trade, tribute, and gift-giving, and it was weighed rather than counted. Now do the arithmetic that has kept scholars arguing for 70 years. 37 coins and 3 blanks make 40 pieces of gold. The ship above them had places for 40 oarsmen. 2 ingots, and a vessel of that kind is steered by more than one man at the stern. The reading, argued most fully by the British Museum's own keeper, is that the purse holds 1 payment for every man needed to row the ship, and 2 more for those who steer her. You do not have to accept it. Plenty of specialists do not. But notice what even the skeptics agree on, which is that this is money placed deliberately in a purse, on a belt, on a body, in a ship. It is not loose change, and it is not jewelry. It is currency positioned as a payment in a grave by people who thought a crew would need paying. Whatever else it is a wage bill, and it may be the oldest one in this country that anybody can still count. The coins do one further job, which is to date the whole thing. None of them was struck later than the middle of the 620s by our reckoning, which puts the burial at around the year 625. The burial had been in the ground for something like 13 centuries when a man on a farm wage put a trowel through the top of it. The silver tells a different part of the same story. Tama! The great dish is more than 2 feet across and carries control stamps from Constantinople, applied in the reign of an emperor who ruled from 491 to 518. It was already about a century old when it went into the ground. It came to Suffolk somehow, as loot, as a diplomatic present, as an inheritance, or through trade, and nobody can say which. The garnets do the same thing at greater distance. The stones set into the shoulder clasps and the sword fittings have been traced to sources far outside Europe in the direction of India and Sri Lanka. Somebody in East Anglia in the 7th century was fitted out with gemstones that had crossed most of the known world before a local craftsman cut them to shape and set them in gold. Put those 3 facts together, the Frankish gold, the Byzantine silver, and the Eastern garnets, and the phrase Dark Ages stops being useful. This is not an isolated backwater. It is a kingdom sitting on a river connected to the continent and through it to Byzantium and beyond, holding a treasury of foreign metal that it valued by weight, in a society wealthy enough to put all of it in a hole and cover it over. The poem describes a ship loaded for a dead king in almost these terms. They laid beside him a mass of treasure, gold and jewels fetched from far-off lands, and no man ever loaded a ship more richly. Beowulf had been read for a century as heroic invention, a story about a world that was mostly made up. Then a field in Suffolk produced the exact scene it describes, and every line of it had to be read again as reportage. Whose grave it was cannot be proved. The best candidate, by date, by wealth and by geography, is Raedwald, king of the East Angles, who died around the year 624 and who was briefly the most powerful ruler in Britain. There is no name in the chamber, and there never was. What can be said is that the burial belonged to someone who could command a ship, a crew, a treasury of imported gold, and a workforce to raise a mound over the lot. The helmet came out of the ground in more than 500 pieces. It had been crushed when the chamber roof fell in, and what was recovered was a box of rusted iron scraps with fragments of tinned bronze paneling attached. The first reconstruction, done at the museum after the war, produced a face that looked plausible and was, on later evidence, wrong in several important respects. Rupert Bruce Mitford spent the best part of his career on Sutton Hoo, and one of his decisions was to have the helmet dismantled and built again from the fragments by a conservator who spent about a year on it. The result is the object everyone in this country can picture without being able to name. The most recognizable face of early England is a jigsaw assembled twice from 500 pieces of rust, and the version we know is the second attempt. The law that failed to catch Sutton Hoo went on failing for another half-century. Treasure Trove asked one question about intent, and a grave answers it in the negative every single time. So the graves, which is to say the most informative finds in British archaeology, sat entirely outside the law that was supposed to protect valuable discoveries, and were allocated instead by the accident of who happened to own the field. That produced two bad outcomes at once. Nationally significant material could be sold abroad by a landowner with a perfect right to do it. And the person who actually found the thing got nothing, unless the landowner chose to be generous. As metal detectors spread through the 1970s and 80s, that second problem stopped being theoretical. A finder who reported a discovery honestly risked walking away with nothing at all, and the incentive ran towards saying nothing and selling quietly. Parliament finally dealt with it. The act that replaced the old law defines its subject by measurement rather than by guesswork about the dead. Any object at least 300 years old when found, which has metallic content of which at least 10% by weight is precious metal. Age and metal. No inquiry into whether a 7th century mourner intended to come back for the purse. Under the new scheme, treasure passes to the Crown. A committee values it at market rates. A museum that wants it pays that sum, and the money is divided between the finder and the landowner. It converted a question of ancient intention into a straightforward transaction, and it turned honest reporting into the profitable option, which is the only reliable way to make a rule stick. The Staffordshire hoard was valued at £3,285,000 under those rules in 2009, and the sum was split between the man with the detector and the farmer who owned the field. That is what the modern system does with a great Anglo-Saxon find. It prices it, buys it for the public, and pays both parties. Run Sutton Who through that machinery, and the picture changes completely. Basil Brown would have had a claim as the finder, and a real one. Edith Pretty would have had a claim as the landowner. A valuation committee would have put a number on the most important assemblage in English archaeology, and a museum would have had to raise it. Under the law as it stood in 1939, the finder got 30 shillings a week and the owner got everything, and the nation got it all only because one private individual decided, without any obligation whatsoever, to hand it over. It took a long time for the second half of that sentence to be said out loud. Brown went on working for Mrs. Pretty and later for the museum at Ipswich, and he died in the 1970s without ever being treated in print as the man who found the ship. His diaries sat in an archive. Oh! The correction came slowly, then all at once, when a film put him at the center of the story, and several million people who had never heard of him learned his name and his wage in the same scene. Both names are in their proper places now. Brown's is on the labels alongside hers. His diaries are treated as the primary record of the 1939 season, and his judgment about the ship has never been faulted. The estate itself passed to the National Trust in 1998, so the mounds are public ground, and the ship-shaped absence lies under the turf where it has always been. So, the question, should a find like that ever belong to one private person at all? On the law as it stood, it did, entirely and absolutely, and the jury that said so was right. What that afternoon in the village hall actually demonstrated is that the fate of the greatest treasure in English history rested on the character of one widow in Suffolk and on nothing else. She chose well. The point is that nothing in the law required her to, and a rule that depends on the person who happens to own the field is not a rule at all. It took another 57 years to write one.